All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. This time we're going to be tackling someone who's maybe not a household name, but definitely a really interesting figure in early 20th century philosophy.
Yeah, John M. McTaggart. He was a really fascinating thinker.
So we're going to be really diving into his world, his thought.
A lot of it's from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on it, which is a really good overview.
Yeah, it's like a nice solid base for us to really understand the complexities of his philosophy. And, for me, what's really intriguing is the argument he makes against the reality of time.
Oh, yeah, it's a big one.
And then on top of that, he's an atheistic mystic.
Kind of a surprising combination, right?
It is. And then,
Yeah.
throw in his unique version of idealism. So we're going to try and unpack all of that.
Yeah, we're going to go for all the key ideas, the things that'll really make you rethink some basic assumptions. So
Exactly. So if you're up for it, strap in. We're going to explore the mind of J.M.E. McTaggart.
yeah, let's start with a little bit about McTaggart himself. So born in London, 1866. Interesting little detail. His name, John McTaggart, Ellis McTaggart.
Ah.
The double McTaggart was because of a stipulation in his great-uncle's will, which is kind of funny.
Oh, wow. A double McTaggart. So he's got this kind of interesting name. And even early on, he was pretty bold intellectually.
Oh, yeah, like getting transferred from his first school because of his atheism.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he wasn't shy about it. He was really committed to it. And then later on, he gets really into Kant, like a lot of philosophers.
Right, right.
And then he ends up at Trinity College, Cambridge. And there, he gets involved with the Cambridge Apostles,
Oh, yeah, that's a big deal.
a really influential intellectual society, kind of secretive, too.
I can only imagine.
And the people he was interacting with there, like Whitehead, Moore, and Russell,
Wow.
in their early years, too.
So he's at the heart of some huge, huge philosophical developments, really.
Absolutely. And he does really well there, like gets a prize fellowship for his dissertation on Hegel's dialectic. So he's clearly very sharp. And that whole early immersion in Hegel is super important, even though his own philosophical methods kind of change later.
Right, right.
So he becomes a lecturer in moral sciences at Trinity, does that until he retires. And what's kind of sad is that he dies in 1925, just before his major work, The Nature of Existence, is published posthumously.
That's too bad.
Yeah, but, his influence is clear. Just look at his allegiances. He thought F.H. Bradley was the greatest of living philosophers,
Wow.
and he was a huge fan of Spinoza. Like, there's even a quote from Spinoza on his tombstone.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's some serious commitment right there.
It really shows you where his head was at philosophically.
For sure. And, we can't talk about McTaggart without mentioning G.E. Moore, because McTaggart had a huge influence on him, especially in terms of clarity. Like, he always pushed Moore to really define his terms, to make sure his arguments were super tight, and that really shaped Moore's own approach to philosophy.
Yeah, and that focus on clarity, that's really valuable.
Absolutely. But, there's more to McTaggart than just the dry philosophy stuff.
Right, there's the personality too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's this great story from Bertrand Russell, who is no stranger to being a little bit, in his head.
Right.
He said McTaggart was even shyer than him.
Really?
Yeah. And he tells this funny story about McTaggart trying to get into Russell's room and
Yep.
taking like forever to do it.
Oh, wow.
And then there's this amazing description of McTaggart from C.D. Broad.
Okay.
He calls him like an 18th century English Whig, a mystic,
Hmm.
who also had the logical mind of a medieval scholar.
That's quite a combination.
It is, right. And then Broad adds that he had this really good business sense, the kind you'd expect in a French mathematician, while also being super into Hegel.
So he's got all these different sides to him. It's fascinating.
It is.
Eh.
And then there are these quirky little things, too, like he used to salute cats.
He saluted cats.
Yeah, apparently. And he had this weird way of walking, kind of sideways like a crab. And there was a poem written about his tricycle, which he apparently found hilarious.
It's great to have these little glimpses into the person behind the philosophy.
It is. It makes him feel more human,
Yeah.
less like this abstract, super serious thinker.
Right, right. Okay, so let's get into his actual philosophy. And one thing that jumps out is that even though he was really into Hegel early on, his later work was more what we'd call analytic metaphysics.
Yeah, he really shifted gears in his approach.
So he's all about this armchair philosophy, deductive reasoning, and these things he called synthetic a priori propositions.
Yeah, so for the philosophers listening, that's a big shift. And it really shows in how skeptical he was of the empirical sciences replacing metaphysics.
Okay.
Like his whole argument was that saying science gives us the final truth about reality is a metaphysical claim, not a scientific one.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And he also pointed out that different metaphysical systems like materialism, idealism, dualism, they can all fit with the same scientific findings. They just interpret those findings differently.
That's a great point. It really shows how metaphysics is kind of working at a deeper level, right?
Totally. It's like the foundation for how we understand the world, even the scientific world. And he had similar issues with using inductive methods in metaphysics.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that.
He had some fundamental problems with the whole idea of induction, and he especially thought it was a bad fit for the universe as a whole.
Why is that?
Well, because we only have one universe, right?
Right.
So he thought trying to generalize about the whole universe based on what we see in our little corner of it was just not very solid.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and especially later on when he starts arguing for an infinite number of existing things, the idea of making these big inductive leaps from our limited experience just seemed really shaky to him.
Okay, so he's not really looking to science to give him answers.
Not really. It's
Yeah.
pretty striking, actually. Like all this stuff happening with Einstein and the revolutions in physics, he barely mentions it. He's
Well,
really committed to this a priori, reason-based approach to figuring out reality.
but that doesn't mean he completely ignores experience.
Right. He does say that experience is how we know that something exists.
Okay.
And it's also how we know that whatever exists has parts, it's differentiated. Although, interestingly, he also thought you could figure that out through a priori reasoning.
Really?
Yeah. But the key thing is that he grants this, what he calls prima facie truth, to our senses.
Meaning what?
So basically, if we perceive something, that's a good reason to believe it's real unless we have really strong a priori arguments against it or our perceptions contradict each other.
Okay, so we kind of start by trusting our senses, but then we use reason to double check.
Exactly. And this becomes super important when we get to his arguments about time, because he starts by accepting that we experience things as temporally ordered,
I
right?
mean, one thing happening before another.
Exactly.
Mm.
But then he uses these super powerful a priori arguments to say that that temporal order isn't actually real.
So even though we experience it that way, it's not the ultimate truth.
Yeah, that's a big part of his whole philosophy. But it's important to remember that he doesn't just dismiss experience completely.
Right, right. And it's also worth mentioning what G.E. Moore, his student, said about him, because Moore was really impressed by McTaggart's clarity and rigor, even when he was dealing with Hegel, who can be really tough to follow.
Oh, yeah. Moore really emphasized how McTaggart made philosophy precise. He always wanted clear definitions, good reasoning, and he hated bad arguments.
So that emphasis on clarity is a big part of his legacy.
For sure. And Moore felt like even if you disagreed with McTaggart, you couldn't deny that he was brilliant, subtle, and above all, committed to clear thinking.
Yeah, and that's a great lesson for anyone trying to do philosophy, right?
Absolutely. You have to understand your own positions and why you hold them, and that's not easy.
Okay, so let's jump into the deep end. McTaggart's argument for the unreality of time. This is what he's most famous for, and it's definitely a mind bender.
Yeah, he seems to have arrived at this conclusion pretty early in his career, maybe even influenced by some mystical experiences he had.
Really?
Yeah, there's evidence he was already thinking about getting rid of time back in 1889, and he had a few different versions of the argument, but the one that's most talked about involves this distinction he makes between what he calls the A series and the B series.
All right, so break it down for us. What's the B series?
So the B series is basically the order of events based on earlier than and later than.
Okay, so a timeline.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
A fixed, unchanging sequence. If event X is earlier than event Y in the B series, that's how it'll always be. Those relationships don't change.
Okay, so that's a pretty straightforward way of thinking about time.
Right. But then there's the A series, which is where things get more interesting.
Okay, what's that about?
So the A series is all about past, present, and future. It's a series that's constantly in flux. Events are moving from being in the future to being present to being in the past.
So it's dynamic, always changing.
Exactly. And McTaggart's key claim is that for time to be real, both of these series have to exist and they have to be fundamental, with the A series being even more basic than the B series.
Okay, so he's saying we need both the fixed order of the B series and the changing nature of the A series for time to really exist.
Right. And from there, he builds this three-part argument to show that time isn't real. So the first part is that time is only real if real change happens.
Yeah, that makes sense. If nothing ever changed, it's hard to see how time would even matter.
Exactly. So then the second part of the argument is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit controversial. He says that real change only happens if the A series exists.
Okay, so explain that one.
So he's saying it's not enough for something to just have different qualities at different points in the B series. Like, imagine a poker that's cooling down.
Right.
That's changing in a way, but for McTaggart, that's not real change. Real change has to involve an event changing its temporal properties, like going from being future to being present to being
So
past.
the event itself has to move through those A-series categories.
Exactly. And he specifically rejects Bertrand Russell's view that change is just different things being true about something at different B-series times.
Okay, so for McTaggart, it's all about this movement through future, present, past. That's what real change is.
Yes. And if there's no A series, if there's no real past, present, and future, then nothing really becomes past or was future. The B series is just this static order. It doesn't have that dynamism that McTaggart thinks is essential for real change.
Okay, I'm following so far. So then what's the third part of the argument?
A third part is where he really drops the bomb. He says that the A series doesn't actually exist.
Whoa. Okay, so how does he get there?
This is where he brings in this idea of a contradiction. He says that the properties of being past, present, and future, they can't all exist together at the same time.
Right, because something can't be both past and present at the same time.
Exactly. But then he says that every event has to have all three of those properties. Like, think of any event that's happening right now.
Okay.
It will be past, and it was future. So every event at some point has to be past, present, and future.
Okay, I can see how that seems like a problem, but how is it a contradiction?
The contradiction is that these A-series properties are supposed to be mutually exclusive. To be present means you're not past or future. But McTaggart is saying every event has to have all of them.
Okay, I see the tension there.
And he considers the obvious response, which is to say that something is present now, was future, and will be past. But he says that's just pushing the problem back.
How so?
Because was future just means it was present at some point before now.
Yeah.
And will be past just means it will be present at some point after now. So you end up with this infinite regress, and you never actually solve the problem of something having all these incompatible properties at the same time. There's no moment where an event is just present, or just past, or just future.
So it's like those labels are always shifting depending on your perspective.
Exactly. And because there's no one right perspective, there's no objective A series. It's all relative.
Okay, so that's how he gets to the A series being an illusion.
Right. And because he already said that real change depends on the A series, and time depends on real change, he concludes that time itself must also be an illusion.
Whoa. So even though it feels so real to us, he's saying time isn't the fundamental truth about reality.
Yeah, it's a really radical idea.
So if time is an illusion, how does he explain why we experience the world as temporally ordered?
This is where he brings in the C series.
The C series.
So the C series is supposed to be this real but non-temporal order that underlies our experience of the B series, the timeline.
Okay, so it's like a deeper order that's not actually temporal.
Exactly. And he saw this as having something in common with Hegel, like there's this underlying reality that maps onto the apparent reality of time, which is different from, say, Kant, who might say that time is just a feature of how our minds work and there's no real counterpart to it out there.
Okay, so he's not just saying time is in our heads, he's saying there's something real behind it, but it's not time as we usually think of it.
Right. And he had a few different ideas about what this C series actually is. Early on, he thought it might be an adequacy series of representations. So the states that seem future to us are actually more accurate representations of this timeless reality than the states that seem past.
Okay, so it's like the future is a better picture of the real truth.
Yeah, that was one way he thought about it, but he eventually moved away from that idea.
And what did he settle on?
His final view was that the C series is an inclusion series of misperceptions ordered by part-whole relationships.
Okay, now that sounds complicated.
It is. Basically, he thought the illusion of time comes from how these mistaken perceptions fit together as parts of bigger, even more mistaken perceptions. And he even admitted that he didn't have a totally complete explanation of how it worked.
Really? That's surprising for someone who is usually so systematic.
It is. But it shows that he was willing to be honest about the limits of his own thinking.
Yeah, that's refreshing.
So anyway, the point is that even though time, as the A series and ultimately the B series, isn't real, our judgments about time can still be well-founded if they accurately reflect this underlying C-series order.
So, like, saying that World War I happened after the American Civil War, that's still true in a way, even though it's not temporally true.
Exactly, because it reflects the correct order in the C-series, even though the C-series isn't temporal itself. So our language about time, our judgments about what came before what, they still have meaning, just not the kind of meaning we usually think they have.
Okay, so we've tackled the unreality of time.
Yeah.
Let's move on to something else that's really interesting about McTaggart, his atheistic mysticism.
Yeah, it's a pretty unusual combination.
It is. Most people think of atheism and mysticism as being opposites.
Right, but McTaggart had his own very specific definitions for those terms. So for him, religion is a certain kind of emotion. It's based on this deep sense of harmony between us and the universe. And crucially, he thought this religious emotion requires a belief that the universe is fundamentally good. So optimism is really important for him.
Yeah, he was a big defender of optimism throughout his whole career.
Totally. But he also insisted that this religious feeling and this optimistic view don't require believing in God.
Okay, so how did he define God?
He said God is a being who's personal, supreme, and good.
Okay.
So personhood is part of the definition, but he doesn't include omnipotence or perfect benevolence. In fact, he was really worried about whether omnipotence even makes sense.
And he actually argues against the existence of that kind of God in his book, The Nature of Existence, right?
Yeah, he does. So because he thinks the universe is fundamentally made up of these immaterial spirits, what he calls primary parts, he argues that God can't be the sum total of everything.
Why not?
Because that would mean one person's made up of other people, which he just didn't think made sense.
Okay.
And he also rejects the idea of God as the creator or the shaper of the universe.
What were his reasons for that?
Well, partly because that would mean some selves are more fundamental than others, which goes against his whole idea of a community of spirits.
Right.
And also because he doesn't believe in time. So the whole idea of creation as this one-time event caused by God just doesn't fit.
Okay, so no traditional God in McTaggart's system, but where does the mysticism come in?
So for McTaggart, mysticism has two main features. The first is recognizing this deep unity in the universe, a unity that goes beyond what we experience in everyday life or what science can tell us.
Okay.
And he saw this as being similar to Hegel's idea of God as a community of spirits, although McTaggart himself avoids using the word God.
Right.
He just talks about this interconnectedness of spirits.
Okay, and what's the second feature of mysticism?
The second feature is the possibility of becoming directly aware of this unity through what he calls mystic intuition.
Mystic intuition, okay.
Yeah, so it's like a kind of direct, non-conceptual awareness, almost like perception, but of this ultimate unity.
So it's not something you figure out through reasoning, it's something you directly experience.
Exactly. And he thought this mystic unity is the fundamental reality, and mystic intuition is our way of accessing it. And he actually claimed to have had these mystical experiences himself, starting when he was pretty young.
Really? What were they like?
He said they were focused on the unity of the universe through love, like this vision of these immaterial spirits existing in this state of loving connection.
Wow.
But he was also careful to say that his personal experiences weren't proof for anyone else. He thought you needed solid philosophical arguments to justify metaphysical and religious claims. He didn't think faith or wishful thinking were good enough.
Which makes sense, given how committed he was to reason and logic.
Totally.
Yeah.
And even though he rejected the reality of time, he still tried to defend a form of immortality and pre-existence of the self. He thought our judgments about past and future lives could still be well-founded if they're based on this underlying non-temporal reality.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about McTaggart's ontological idealism. So he believed that reality is ultimately made up of persons, right?
Yeah, he was an idealist,
Yeah.
through and through. He thought that at the most fundamental level, existence is mental or spiritual.
Okay.
But he combined that with epistemological realism, which is the view that knowledge is true belief, and truth means our beliefs match up with reality.
Okay, so he's not saying that nothing is real unless we're aware of it.
No, not at all.
And once again, you can see the influence of Hegel here, right? With that idea of the absolute spirit as this community of individuals who are perceiving and loving each other.
Yeah, for sure. McTaggart's picture of reality is basically this collection of persons and their mental states, which he considered to be parts of the persons themselves.
Okay.
And perception is key in his system. Persons perceive other persons or their parts, including their mental states. And he was careful to distinguish between perceiving someone's mental state and actually having that mental state yourself.
Right, those are two different things.
Definitely. And he had some pretty strong beliefs about these selves, these persons.
Like what?
So he thought, a priori, that no two selves share any proper parts, that no self is a part of another self, and that no experience can exist without being an experience of some self.
Okay, so selves are really fundamental for him.
Absolutely. And while he thought persons have parts, their mental states, he said the property of being a person, what he called personality, is a simple, unanalyzable quality. It's like the glue that holds all those mental states together and makes them a self.
Interesting. But it sounds like our everyday perceptions are pretty far off from this reality of persons, according to McTaggart.
Yeah, he thought we were massively mistaken about the true nature of things.
Like how?
Well, he said we never directly perceive material objects like we think we do. Our experience of them is always based on inference.
Okay.
And even sense data, which some philosophers think are the most immediate things we perceive, he said those don't really exist as separate things either.
What are they then?
He said they're actually misperceptions of persons or parts of persons or groups of parts. So we're still perceiving something real, it's just not what we think it is.
So our whole picture of the world is kind of warped.
Yeah, pretty much. And he thought this was directly connected to our misperception of the C series as the A series, that illusion of time.
Okay, so the way we perceive time is messing up our perception of everything else.
Exactly. He thought the illusion of time was like this distorting lens that we see everything through.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, his argument for this whole idealist view, it's pretty complex. It involves these concepts of gunkiness and sufficient descriptions.
Yeah, it's a tough one. But basically it goes like this. First, he says that everything is gunky.
Gunky, what does that mean?
It means having an infinite number of proper parts, each of which is also a thing.
Okay.
And then he says that everything has to have what he calls a sufficient description.
What's that?
It's a description that uniquely identifies that thing using only its internal, non-relational properties.
Okay, so it's like a complete description that doesn't rely on anything outside the thing itself.
Exactly. And the problem comes when you try to apply these two conditions to material objects or sense data.
So if those things are the fundamental reality, they should be both gunky and have sufficient descriptions.
Right.
Oh.
But he argues that they can't be both. That leads to a contradiction.
Okay, I'm starting to see where he's going with this.
So the only way to resolve the contradiction, he says, is if the fundamental things in the universe are what he calls primary parts, which are persons. And the relation between them is what he calls determining correspondence, which is basically perception.
So it's all about persons and their perceptions of each other.
Yeah. And this structure, he says, allows for sufficient descriptions all the way down.
Okay, so because materialism and sense data theories run into this contradiction, he concludes that idealism is the only option that actually works.
Right. He's basically saying we can't even conceive of something fundamental that's not either material, a sense datum, or spiritual. And he's already ruled out the first two. So he's left with spiritual entities, which for him are persons and their mental states.
It's interesting that he's different from some other idealists in that he believes in the reality of relations and he's a pluralist.
Yeah, that sets him apart. He was very clear that relations are real and relational statements can be objectively true.
Which makes sense given how central perception is to his system.
Definitely. Perception is a relation, so he has to take relations seriously.
And he rejected monism, the idea that there's only one kind of thing or only one ultimate reality.
He did. He thought the extreme version of monism, where everything is just one undifferentiated thing, basically leads to nothingness.
Okay.
And the less radical version, where there's only one kind of substance, he rejected that too. Because he thought it was a priori true that every substance has infinitely many parts, so there have to be multiple things. He even rejected solipsism, the idea that only your own mind exists.
So he's a pluralist through and through.
Absolutely. But his pluralism is specific. He thinks individual selves are fundamental, even though they're all immaterial. So it's like a monism about the kind of substance, but a pluralism about the number of substances.
Okay, so the universe is this community of individual immaterial selves.
That's the picture.
McTaggart also had some other pretty wild metaphysical views, right? Like this hyperessentialism thing.
Oh yeah, that's a really radical idea.
Yeah.
He basically said that every substance, except for the whole of reality, has all of its features, essentially.
Meaning it couldn't have been any different.
Yeah, not even slightly different. And to deal with the fact that we obviously think things could have been different, he even started to sound a bit like a counterpart theorist.
Okay, how so?
He suggested that a slightly different entity, like a slightly different version of Mount Snowdon, wouldn't be the actual Mount Snowdon, but it would be similar enough that we'd still call it that.
So it's like there are all these almost identical versions of things in some other possible world.
Kind of, yeah. And then there's his distinction between reality and existence, which is also pretty unusual.
Okay, break that down for us.
So he said both reality and existence are these simple, basic qualities that can't be defined in terms of anything else. He said reality is basically just being, but existence is more specific. It's not just being real and existing in space and time, because he argued that nothing that exists is actually in space and time.
Whoa, okay.
Because something can be real without existing, according to him. And then he tries to show that either reality and existence are the same thing, or that by studying existence, we can learn about reality as a whole. And this leads him to argue against the reality of things like propositions and possibilities.
Okay, so he's really getting into the weeds of what it means to be real and to exist.
Yeah, he's going deep. And then there are his views on mereology, the study of parts and wholes. He had some really specific and detailed ideas about that.
Like what?
Well, one of the most striking is this principle of unrestricted composition.
Okay, what's that?
It's the idea that any collection of things, no matter how random, automatically makes up a new thing.
So like me, you, and that lamp over there, we're all part of a new thing.
Exactly, however bizarre that seems. And he took this principle to its logical conclusion.
Like what?
Like he said, there's a thing made up of all the people reading the Stanford Encyclopedia right now, plus the moon.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, he wasn't afraid of the strange implications. And this led him to his idea of the universe, which is just the thing that's composed of absolutely everything else.
Okay, so everything is part of this one giant thing, the universe.
Right. And he also believed in temporal parts, the idea that things have parts that correspond to different moments in time, although he seemed to think this is a pretty uncontroversial view.
Interesting. And then there's his idea that all substances are gunky, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah, he was really committed to that.
Yeah.
But he also made this careful distinction between compound substances and groups, which are more like sets defined by their members than by their properties.
Okay.
And you have this whole system for how groups work, with rules about how they can't be members of themselves and stuff like that.
That sounds very intricate.
It is. And then, maybe the most surprising thing, he seems to have endorsed this idea of relative identity.
What's that?
It's the idea that two things can be the same substance but different groups. He uses the example of counties and parishes in Great Britain.
So like the same area of land can be both a county and a parish.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's a really tricky concept, but it shows how far he was willing to push the boundaries of our usual ways of thinking about identity.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with McTaggart's metaphysics. Let's wrap up by touching on his ethics. It seems like that wasn't his main focus, but he still had some interesting things to say.
Yeah, his metaphysics was definitely center stage, but his ethics are still worth exploring.
So what were his main views?
Early on, when he was more influenced by Hegel, he was kind of a consequentialist. He thought the ultimate good was harmony and happiness. He even suggested that hedonistic utilitarianism might be a good practical guide for making moral decisions.
Okay.
But later on, he shifted to a more realist view of ethics. He thought goodness and badness were just basic qualities that couldn't be broken down any further.
Okay.
And he said that individual persons, or their mental states,